Hello. This is the second lecture on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. In the last lecture, we didn't really get into the text. We talked a little bit about the historical context of Aristotle, and then we also talked about um, kind of the philosophical background for where the Nicomachean Ethics is going to start from. We talked about the four causes being the material cause, the efficient cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. And then we also talked a little bit about the structure of the universe for Aristotle, where we had at the center of the universe this kind of pure potential, which is motionlessness. And then at the outside edge of the universe, we had the unmoved mover, which we called pure actuality. And we talked about how the things at the different layers of the universe, as we go out kind of in concentric circles, are all striving. They're all striving for greater actuality. So the whole cosmic system then for Aristotle is driven by desire. And so that's where we're going to start our text. And you'll see, I think, as we go through, that it's important to understand these concepts kind of before we start, and because Aristotle's going to give us an ethics that is teleological, and it's important that we understand this from the very beginning, because later on, several weeks from now, we're going to be studying an ethical system that is consequentialist, based upon the consequences of action, and we want to make sure that we understand that Aristotle's not doing the same thing. That Aristotle is giving us a different kind of ethics that's based on the telos, or the final end of human activity and human behavior. And so I actually went back and I looked at some of the lecture videos, and I want to apologize because I spent a lot of time looking down like this. And when I'm looking down like this, I'm reading from notes, and I'm reading from the text. And then when I look up, then I'm kind of delivering commentary on it. And it's a difficult thing to kind of get used to this format, because I don't get to see you out there. I don't get to make eye contact with anybody who's sitting in the room. And so I will ask that you just kind of be patient with me as I kind of get myself accustomed to this new media. But we're going to start today really looking at the text, and we're going to start on page 46, this is book one of the text. And so you'll remember from our last lecture that book one, often you'll find that the whole book will deal with the same theme, but sometimes it doesn't. But why it was called a book was because it fit on one scroll of papyrus that was then rolled up and put into the jar, and the full jar had the complete text. At least that's what we hope. So let's begin, right? So we did read the first sentence last time, right? Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim, right? So we started with that. We're going to jump over to the next page, and we're going to look at some of what he has to say over there, right? So this is in point 2, paragraph 2. He says that if then there is some end of the things that we do which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, for at that rate the process would go on to infinity, so that our desire would be empty and vain. Right? And so what is he talking about here? Well, he's talking about when there's this chain of reasons why we do things. Right? So you might think of something simple, right? Like having lunch. Right? So there's a reason why we have lunch, and that's to satisfy our hunger. But hunger itself has its own end, right? So there's a reason why we get hungry, and the reason why we get hungry is because our bodies are not properly nourished. They're requiring nourishment. And the reason why they're requiring nourishment, see, we get this chain. 1, 2, 3. The reason why they're requiring nourishment is because our body itself is desiring health, right? So that's a higher cause. So in terms of our physical bodies, right, that might be the highest cause. That might be the higher end to which all of the other ends of our bodily activities are oriented would be the desire of the body for health. And that's kind of a strange way to talk. We don't talk that way anymore. We might talk of our personal desire for health, but we wouldn't talk of the body's desires for health. But Aristotle would. Aristotle would. So that's what he's talking about here. He wants to hit on in the realm of ethics, which is the realm of human behavior. He wants to hit on what that ultimate highest good is, right? So he continues. He says, "Shall we not, like the archers who have a mark to aim at, be more likely to hit upon what is right?" Right? He said, "It would seem to belong to the most authoritative art, and that which is most truly the master art. And politics appears to be of this nature." Right? And so he's saying that the master art, so arts are things that human beings do, activities of human beings. So we have art, one of them might be agriculture, one of them might be, you know, um, sewing, making clothing. We have all different kinds of arts. And what he's saying here is that the master art is politics. Now, this sounds strange to us, because we live in a time where politics is derided, right? Politics is thought of as kind of an ugly business, not one of the higher activities of the human mind. But Aristotle would say that the reason we have that bad concept of it is because it's so important to us and it's being done poorly. So what is politics? The politics really then is the art of living well together with our fellow human beings. That's what politics is. It's figuring out how to live well together with other people. So, politics, right? He says, "Politics appears to be of this nature, for it is this that ordains which of the sciences should be studied in a state, and which each class of citizens should learn, and up to what point they should learn them. And we see even the most highly esteemed of capacities to fall under this, for example, strategy, economics, rhetoric. Now, since politics uses the rest of the sciences, and since again it legislates as to what we are to do and what we are to abstain from, the end of this science must include those of the others, so that this end must be the good for man." Right? So again, he's placing things in a hierarchy. He's saying, well, there's these other sciences, and he lists some of them, right? He lists some of the other sciences. Strategy, economics, rhetoric, those are other arts, right? And he says that politics orders those, right? And we can think about this because we've seen it we have seen it recently in healthcare, right? Healthcare, the sciences of healthcare, the art of healthcare, is kind of its own concern, right? And it has as its goals the health of human bodies, and it has its subdisciplines, right? We have like epidemiology, that's been the one that's been in the news most lately with the coronavirus. But we can see that epidemiology really is underneath, it's subordinated to health, right? So disease prevention is part of the promotion of health. But the promotion of health itself falls under politics. We make political decisions to see, how we should engage that science. Because what is healthcare oriented towards? We think of it as oriented towards the health of the individual human being, and it is, but more than that, it's oriented towards the health of the human society, or the health of all of the human beings in the society. We wouldn't say that a country had a good healthcare system if most of the people were ill and just a few of them had excellent care, right? We need to orient that politically. So even the discussions that we have in this country about healthcare reform, Um, Even those people who are in favor of increased privatization are in favor of it not because they want to reduce the quality of care available to most people, but because they think that this is what's going to enhance the quality of care that's available to most people. They will get more total health um, than the other. And so all of these things are subordinated to politics. Because remember that politics is the art or the science of figuring out how to live well with one another. Right? The fact that in our time, in our day and age, politics kind of is failing a lot doesn't mean that that's not what it is. Right? So keep that in mind. Okay? Because the next thing that he's going to talk about, right, is that you have to be prepared. You have to be prepared to enter into this political art, because this is the highest art of the community, right? And so he says on page 48 in the middle, he says, hence, a young man is not a proper hearer of lectures on political science, for he is inexperienced in the actions that occur in life. But its discussions start from these and are about these. And further, since he tends to follow his passions, his studies will be vain and unprofitable, because the end aimed at is not knowledge, but action. Right? He says, for to such persons as to the incontinent, knowledge brings no profit, but to those who desire and act in accordance with a rational principle, knowledge about such matters will be of great benefit. So you have to be prepared. You have to go in motivated to learn, and there are certain habits that are required to be able to engage in the art of politics, or even to be able to learn about the art of politics. You need certain habits or dispositions to be able to get there. So that's why he says the young man isn't ready, right? The young man is caught up in flights of passions, right? They don't have enough experience about life. But really, what he's going to get at is that the young man might not be virtuous. And there's things that we're going to learn that we can do about that. Right? And this really is going to form the kind of the basis of his project in the Nicomachean Ethics, is how to habituate people in virtuous habits so they can be ready to do the work of politics, which is figuring out how we can live well with one another in community. Right? That's what his project is. Right? So at the bottom of 48, under section 4 there, he says, let us resume our inquiry and state, in view of the fact that all knowledge and every pursuit aims at some good. What is that we say political science aims at? And what is the highest of all goods achievable by action? Right? So what is the good? So we've come to the point where we've discovered the highest art, right? Which is political science, which enables us to live well with one another. And we're going to ask, what is the good that art aims at, right? What is the telos, or the purpose of that art? And that's the question of the first part, right? He says, verbally, there is a very general agreement, both for the general run of men and people of superior refinement, say that it is happiness, and identify living well and doing well with being happy. So he's got some agreement. It's about happiness, right? He's not going to let that go, but right away he's going to say this is not a sufficient answer, right? He says, because with regard to what happiness is, they differ. And many do not give the same account as the wise, for the former think it is some plain and obvious thing, like pleasure, wealth, or honor. They differ, however, from one another, and often even the same man identifies it with different things, with health when he is ill, with wealth when he is poor. But conscious of their ignorance, they admire those who proclaim some great ideal that is above their comprehension. Now some thought that apart from these many goods, there is another which is self-subsistent and causes the goodness of all these as well. Right? And that's where he's going to go, right? Because he talks about, well, health, wealth, and other things that we strive after as goods that we misidentify with happiness. He's saying that there's going to be something above those that's going to unite them all together, right? Going to be something above that unites. Okay, so we're going to skip forward a few pages, and he's going to get kind of into a greater detail about things. We're going to skip forward to page 53 there in section 7. Right, so he's not letting this thread go. So do read all of the stuff that he says, but we're going to pick up our discussion here in paragraph 7 there on page 53. He says, it seems different in different actions and arts. It is different in medicine, in strategy, and the other arts likewise. What then is the good of each? Surely that for whose sake everything else is done. In medicine, this is health. In strategy, victory. In architecture, a house. In any other sphere, something else. In every action and pursuit, the end. For it is for the sake of this that all men do whatever else they do. So I am sorry that the phone rang. I don't know if that got picked up on the mic. It probably did because it's right in front of me. But what he's saying is that there's going to be a unifying thing, and we want to remember that his picture of the universe, right? That we go from the pure potential, right, and then moving away from that, we get diversity. But then also when we move upwards, we get different levels of unity, right? Because the motion goes faster until we get to the edge, right, where we have the unmoved mover, and that actually is the unifying principle of the whole thing. So he wants to find the good that is the unifying principle of all of the other things that we do in this kind of realm of human behavior, which is the art of politics. So that's what he's saying. There needs to be something that unifies, right? And so in the next paragraph down there, kind of in the middle of the paragraph, it says, clearly, not all ends are final ends, but the chief good is evidently something final, right? So what is he talking about when he's talking about final ends? He's talking about final cause. That's why we had the lecture about causes before this one, is that you're going to have a chief end, you're going to have a final cause. It's something that's going to be able to explain the behavior, right? And there's a highest thing. That's what we're looking for. That's what we're looking for. Okay. And then over on page 57, so we're gonna skip forward a few pages, kind of there in the bottom third of the page, right? He's talking about pleasures. So before we get into this, I want to say a little bit about ancient philosophy and the concept of pleasure. So one of the things that we inherit from our Christian civilization, right? And being in America, we are inheritors of Christian civilization, even those of us who aren't Christians, is we kind of have this negative view of pleasure. And in the Christian tradition, there's this tradition of asceticism, right? Of giving up pleasures for the heavenly kingdom. And so what that does is it gives us a negative view of pleasure itself, that we when we think of pleasure, we don't necessarily equate that to the good. And this is something that wasn't shared in ancient thinking, right? In ancient thinking, remember, Aristotle's whole universe was driven by the idea of desire, that we are desiring the good, desiring the good, desiring the good. And the way that that operates is pleasure. Now, pleasure may not be the highest good, but there's this connection between desire and pleasurability that you can't escape. So when he talks about pleasure, keep that in mind, right? So he says then on page 57, now for most men, their pleasures are in conflict with one another, because these are not by nature pleasant, but the lovers of what is noble find pleasant the things that are by nature pleasant, and virtuous actions are such, so that these are pleasant for such men as well as in their own nature. What is he talking about here? Well, a lot of people, our pleasures are in conflict, right? We know this, right? This fits with our experience. So, think about something simple like the weekend. So I'm recording this lecture on Saturday. And so a lot of people, right, they like to do things with their Saturdays. They like to go out for a walk or a hike, or they like to go for a run, or they might go to, there's a lot of communities have these fun runs, or they might like to go bicycling, or they might want to go fishing. But there's a lot of people who on Saturday want to take their time, especially in these kind of delightful days of May, and go and do some outdoor recreation. That's what they want to do. They find it pleasurable, right? And it is, and you can see in a lot of those things that actually aims towards a higher good, right? It aims towards the good of health. But in conflict with that are some of the desires that we have, like on Friday evening. So Friday evening, people like to go out to the bars, or they like to go to a party, and they might want to drink alcohol, or they might have a few too many, and they might stay out too late. And this then comes into conflict with their desire for Saturday, right? If you overindulge on Friday and you stay out too late on Friday, then you don't get enough sleep, and you end up sleeping in on Saturday, and you might not feel well on Saturday morning, and it conflicts with your desire to do pleasurable recreation. So I think this is something that a lot of young people really can get, right? That our pleasures are in conflict. So there needs to be something to order them, right? And that's what he's talking about. And he says, but that for most men, the pleasures are in conflict, but the lovers of what is noble find pleasant the things that are thereby, or that are by nature pleasant, and virtuous actions are such. So what is he talking about? Well, let's take temperance, right? And a lot of the classical philosophers are going to talk about temperance. But so on Friday nights, there's a lot of people who are overindulgent, let's say, with drink. So we know that this happens, right? But the lover of virtue, right, is going to be temperate. He's going to be moderate in how much he drinks, because this rightly structures his pleasures and brings them out of conflict with one another, so that he can enjoy a sociable time on Friday, and then he can also then enjoy a recreational time on Saturday, right? Because he's learned to desire the social time on Friday in the right way, in a way that doesn't bring his desires for pleasurable activities into conflict, right? Doesn't bring them into conflict, right? So he says that if this is so, right, this is at the bottom of the paragraph there on page 57. If this is so, virtuous actions must be in themselves pleasant, right? but they are also good and noble, and have each of these attributes in the highest degree. Since the good man judges well about those attributes, his judgment is such as we have described. Right? So, yes, that's what we would expect. Right? So the one who is learning to love the virtue of, say, temperance is the one who, there's a nobility and an excellence in that virtue itself that is higher than the pleasure of the indulgent over-consumer, right? It's higher and better because it takes the pleasures and it takes the conflict away from them, right? And why is he talking about this? Well, because he's getting to the final end, right? He says happiness, and this is at the bottom of page 57. Happiness is the last word on that page. We're going to continue right over onto page 58. Happiness, then, is the best, noblest, and most pleasant thing in the world, right? Happiness is the best, noblest, and most pleasant thing in the world, and these attributes are not severed as in the inscription at Delos, right? Most noble is that which is justice, and best which is health, but pleasantness is to win what we love, right? Because happiness is what marries justice and health and pleasantness, right? He says, for all of these properties belong to the best activities, and these or one of the best of these we identify with happiness. So happiness is going to be this overriding concern, right? We have this desire for social time on Fridays, and we have this desire for recreation time on Saturdays, and the goods that ride above those, the good that rides above those two things, is the good of happiness. That is the thing for the sake of which the other pleasures are desired, right? So happiness is the forsake of which we desire the lower pleasures, right? And those lower pleasures could be, food or drink or health or wealth, right? Or sociability or recreation. All of these things are lower pleasures that are desired for the sake of the higher pleasure, which is happiness, right? Happiness is the thing that unifies. Now, it's really important that we understand what he means when he says happiness. Okay, because it's not like our same word. So the word that is translated in your text as happiness in the Greek is a word eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. So if we were to spell that out in English letters, it would be eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. Right? And eudaimonia is this higher end that unites the lower diverse ends underneath it. It's the thing for the sake of which, right? And we want to kind of break down that word. So the first part of it is you, right? And that's a Greek root, and we see that root come up in a few other English words, right? So one of those English words is euphoria, right? Euphoria is kind of this kind of superabundant happiness, this kind of ecstatic happiness. And then we also see this in the word euthanasia, right? So what is euthanasia? Euthanasia means happy death, right? So that's one word. So you means happiness, but then we've got this paired with a root that's daimonia, daimona. And so the root of this other part is daimon. And you might notice that it sounds kind of like the English word for demon, because that's where we get the word demon. It comes from the Greek, but eudaimonia doesn't mean like a demonic happiness. That's not what it means. Daimon was kind of the word in the time of Aristotle that meant kind of supernatural being, right? Um, and it could either be like a supernatural angelic being or a supernatural demonic being, but it was definitely kind of has an otherworldly characteristic, right? And so when the word came into English, right, it meant spiritually bad creature, but it doesn't have that connotation in the original, but it did have kind of this otherworldliness. And so I think a good translation of eudaimonia isn't just happiness, but it's kind of like this blessed happiness, right? Or this heavenly happiness. Or maybe even you might even want to call it bliss. Um, it's that kind of happiness where it's quieter. It's a quieter happiness, but it's a more refined and higher one, right? So let's take a look at the next paragraph. Right? So on paragraph 9, and again, this is still on page 58, he says, for this reason, also, the question is asked whether by happiness is to be acquired by learning or habituation or some other sort of training, or comes in virtue of some divine providence, or again by chance. Right? Because if it comes by chance, why is he writing about it? You're going to have it or you don't. Right? But a lot of people think that it comes by chance or by luck. And he's not going to go in that direction. He says, now, if there's any gift of the gods to men, it is reasonable that happiness should be God-given, the most surely God-given of all human things, inasmuch as it is the best. But this question would perhaps be more appropriate to another inquiry. Happiness seems, however, even if it is not God-sent, but comes as a result of virtue and some process of learning or training, to be among the most godlike things. For that which is the prize and end of virtue seems to be the best thing in the world, and something godlike and blessed. Right? So that's the point of this book, right? That's the point of this book. So happiness is something blessed. He says it's here, right? And so that's kind of speaks to our understanding of eudaimonia as a blessed happiness. And it's something godlike, but it's found or it's acquired through exercising the virtues. And that's why he's writing this book, right? Is to teach us about the virtues. He says on page 59, he says, the answer to the question we are asking is plain also from the definition of happiness. For it has been said to be a virtuous activity of the soul of a certain kind. Of the remaining goods, some must necessarily pre-exist as conditions of happiness, and others are naturally cooperative and useful as instruments. And this will be found to agree with what we said at the outset, for we stated that the end of political science is the best end, and political science spends most of its pains on making the citizens to be of a certain character, namely good and capable of noble acts. Right? So that's where we're going. That there is an education possible. Right? So happiness is it's not just the end of virtuous activity, but it's equated with the virtues themselves, for exercising the virtues. It's the virtuous activity of the soul is identified almost with eudaimonia, right? And he says that we call neither ox nor horse nor any other animals happy, for none of them is capable of sharing in such activity, right? Animals aren't virtuous. Animals aren't virtuous. They can be trained, but they don't exercise the virtue, right? They don't um, engage the art of politics. Only human beings do that. Oh, and I have to apologize. You're going to hear the phone ringing again. but it'll stop soon. There, it stopped. We're going to skip forward a few pages to page 63, where we're going to pick up this thread again. He says on page 63, paragraph 13 there, he says, since happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with perfect virtue, we must consider the nature of virtue, for perhaps we shall thus see better the nature of happiness, right? And this is the theme of the text, right? The true student of politics, too, is thought to have studied virtue above all things, for he wishes to make his fellow citizens good and obedient to the laws. As an example of this, we have the lawgivers of the Cretans and the Spartans, and others of the kind that there may have been. And if this inquiry belongs to political science, clearly the pursuit of it will be in accordance with our original plan. But clearly the virtue we must study is human virtue. For the good we were seeking was the human good, and the happiness a human happiness, right? A human eudaimonia. By human virtue, we mean not that of the body, but that of the soul. And happiness also we call an activity of the soul. But if this is so, clearly the student of politics must know somehow the facts about soul, as the man who is to heal the eyes or the body as a whole must know about the eyes or the body. And all the more since politics is more prized and better than medicine, but even among doctors the best educated spend much labor on acquiring knowledge of the body. The student of politics, then, must study the soul, and must study it with these objects in view, and do so just to the extent which it is sufficient for the questions we are discussing. For further precision is perhaps something more laborious than our purposes require. So what is he saying? He's saying that's what we're doing, right? That's what we're doing, and that's not just what we're doing in the Nicomachean Ethics. That in fact is the reason why they have an ethics class at Finlandia. That's the whole purpose for this class, is so that you can study the soul and get an idea of virtue, so that you can go out into the world and know how to live well with your fellow human beings, right? This is the Aristotelian concept of virtue. We will study the virtues so that we can go out into the world and know how to live well with our fellow human beings, so that we ourselves can acquire happiness and eudaimonia, and to also help our fellow human beings to do the same thing. Okay. That brings us really to the end of book 1. And what have we done here? So we've moved from saying, well, every art has an end, right? We've moved from that, that's where we started, to now we know that the purpose of virtuous activity is so that we can live well together as human beings, and that all of the goods that we desire, that we strive for, are united upwards to, and then subordinated therefore to, a higher end, and that end is eudaimonia, right? That end is eudaimonia, or blessed happiness. And we know also that it's going to be the exercise of the virtues that bring us to eudaimonia. And the purpose of politics, the highest art, is to figure out how to bring those virtues to the people. And that's where we are. That's where we are at the end of the section on book 1. So I'm going to stop the lecture here, and then we will have another lecture on book 2, which is going to talk about virtues then as kind of these habits of soul. So we know that virtue is an activity of the soul. We already have that. but we're going to talk about virtue as a habit. And that is what's going to bring us then to the word ethics.